What is Loop Hero? Or to be more precise, who is Loop Hero? Folks, it's actually Perry the Platypus, an Australian semi-aquatic egg-laying mammal with the bill of a duck, the feet of an otter, the tail of a beaver, and also capable of electrolocation like a shark. On top of this, he's also a secret agent who's locked in an eternal struggle with an evil scientist who may or may not be actually evil. Similarly, Loop Hero is a chimeric retro pixel art indie game with deck building, card playing, classic JRPG-esque fighting, equipment managing, and town building. It's also a roguelite that involves the hero being locked in an eternal struggle with an evil scientist who may or may not be actually evil. See, exactly the same thing. Is it mouthful? Yes. Is it confusing? Maybe. But don't worry, I, Wizkidace, am here to explain. So, Loop Hero is a brand new indie rogue-lite game developed by 4 Quarters and published by Devolver Digital. As with most Devolver games, Loop Hero can be pretty weird. It mixes elements from a wide range of genres, such as deck builders, JRPGs, and even idle clicker games, into a roguelite and presents it with an impressive retro pixel art style and a nostalgia-inducing headbanging soundtrack. Sort of like how my mom mixes in kale and broccoli into my favorite dishes just so that I'd be forced to eat them. Also like my mom's experiments, Loop Hero somehow manages to be completely edible, despite its very wild blend. And in fact, kinda tastes good. So, what's it about? You see, this is a loop, and you are the hero over here, and you go around the loop fighting monsters, and that's literally why it's called Loop Hero. Very ingenious. The premise being that an evil lich has broken apart and casted the world into oblivion and trapped everyone and everything in a time loop, like Groundhog Day. You play as a hero who wants to put the world back together and break this time loop. So let's start by looking at the gameplay. Before you start a run, you can edit your deck and also choose your class and the level that you want to play. There are currently 3 classes in the game: warriors, rogues, and necromancers, each having certain class-specific items and stats. You can only play as the warrior in the beginning of the game, and in my opinion, that's the most reliable class, but you can unlock other classes as you progress through the game. Now, to the deck building part. You can choose which cards you'll take into a run. The cards in this game are basically tiles you can place during the game to make buildings or terrain. These either spawn enemies or do something helpful for you. There are upper and lower limits to how many cards you can take into a run. And just like most deck builders, I personally find it best to take the least possible so you can avoid drawing garbage hands.
But my grandpa put all his gaming knowledge, his whole heart, into assembling this deck. I have to believe that it holds some secret strategy. This card is useless.
The game has 4 main bosses, each with their own level or stage. There's the first boss, the Lich, aka Dr. Doofenshmirtz, who just wants to solve the heat death of the entire goddamn universe, as we do. Then there's Mercy, but from League of Legends, followed by Stone Helsing, and finally, Jared Leto 2020. Levels are procedurally generated, but are only different in their length, difficulty, and the boss you face. The easier the level, the less resources you can gather, and the last level has no cap on gatherable resources, so that's the best to grind on, obviously. But I'll get to the resource gathering later on. At the start of the run, you get a random assortment of cards from your deck. I use the term deck very loosely because Loop Hero does not have a draw or discard pile. You get more cards whenever you defeat enemies, but it's completely random and you can't tell what you're gonna draw or what you've already used. The game is actually largely automated. You start the game at the campfire, and hitting play will make your character move all by themselves. Every time they cross the campfire, they heal for a bit, a loop is completed, and the loop level goes up, which levels up the enemies you fight, but it also improves the equipment you find, so it's sort of a double-edged sword. Your character will automatically fight any enemy they run into, and the combat itself is also completely automatic. Your character and the enemies have a set attack speed and other stats like evasion, counterattack, etc. They'll just dish it out until one of them goes down. Defeating enemies gives you more random copies of your cards, random equipment items, and of course, experience points. You can choose what to equip and basically make yourself a build because different items are going to prioritize different stats. Leveling up lets you choose from 3 random traits, which are basically passives to help you on your current run. As I said, the cards are simply tiles like buildings or terrain that you can place on the map. The idea being that you're remembering and putting the world back together again. These structures can do one of 3 things. They can either spawn enemies, help you fight enemies, or grant you stat bonuses. For example, the Grove will spawn rat wolves for you to fight every other day, the Lantern reduces the number of enemies you'll fight, and the mountains or even the rocks will increase your max HP every time you place one. Well, there's also Oblivion that can just yeet anything and everything, so technically cards can do 4 things. There are a decent number of cards for us to play around with, and placing certain tiles next to each other causes special interactions. Like placing a meadow next to any non-meadow tile makes it bloom and improves its effect. Or placing rocks or mountain tiles in a 3x3 grid turns them into a huge mountain peak and gives you a shit ton of HP. There are some really cool interactions too, like if you put a vampire mansion next to a normal village, it causes the vampires to ransack the village and turn people into ghouls. After a few days though, this ransacked village becomes Count's Land, which is a better version of the base village because apparently the villagers and the vampires have decided to work together and prosper. I have no clue how that works, but it heals me for a shit ton and gives me some rewards, so I'm cool with it. But not all interactions are positive though. Some interactions might be bad for you, so you gotta keep an eye out. Playing cards other than Oblivion also adds to the boss gauge, and when it's full, the bosses spawn on the campfire. So you can technically control when to fight the boss. The core strategy of the game is firstly to spawn just enough monsters to farm gear and XP, but obviously not too many to overwhelm you. Secondly, you have to spawn the boss at the right moment when you have strong enough gear, but before the game gets too difficult due to the loop level. There is also a day mechanic in this game. A bar on the top left indicates the passing of the day. Tiles that spawn enemies do so once every day or once every few days, and some of your passives also recharge on a daily basis. Like my favorite passive, which gives you 65% max health shield every day for free. Just like any roguelite, there is a progression system on top of this, and that's where the resources I mentioned come in. You can collect a variety of resources, such as literal sticks and stones, by just walking around or when you defeat enemies and bosses. These are used for upgrading your camp and also for crafting furniture. If you die though, you drop 66% of your resources, but you do have the option to flee from a run, which will cause you to lose only a third of your resources. But if you hit flee when you're near your camp, you get to keep all of the resources that you've collected so far. Speaking of the camp, your camp is more like a small Animal Crossing town, complete with its own sardonic human version of Isabelle. You can use the resources to build a variety of structures that unlock new abilities and cards, as well as classes. Like building a cemetery will allow you to resurrect ones when you die during your run, which is not how cemeteries should work unless you're Stephen King or a useless vampire, but hey, I resurrect, so that's useful. You can also place items like furniture, tools, and food in your camp, which increase a variety of your base stats like HP or healing. You can either craft these furniture or randomly find them during your run. You can increase the amount of furniture, tools, and food you can house by constructing more buildings like houses and warehouses. I have no clue how hoarding random household items can make you stronger, but maybe I haven't tried it yet, or maybe someone on the dev team is an actual raccoon with a hoarding disorder who wanted to put this in. But this is a central mechanic with which you can get stronger, and you need to use this if you want to beat the later bosses. I kinda broke the system by primarily hoarding a lot of bread, a shit ton of medieval gaming chairs, and some children's chemistry sets. The bread increases your max HP, the gaming chairs for some reason give you lifesteal, and the chemistry sets give you more potions to hoard. So at the end I had over double my base HP, had 60% lifesteal, and a ton of potions from the get-go. And those are just some of the stats I gained from my landfill. So that's basically how you play the game. You place tiles like in a tower defense game, and equip stuff like in an RPG. Apart from that though, the game basically plays itself. Your hero guy laps around a random Hot Wheels track, ramming enemies and finally colliding headfirst into the boss. Of course, occasionally taking a break in a bootleg Animal Crossing town and also training in your very own landfill. This game can sound complicated, but that's mainly because it's a wild blend of different genres. Now that we know how the game plays, let's look at what it gets right and what it doesn't. Starting with the things that the game does get right, the most striking thing about Loop Hero is its very detailed and beautiful retro pixel art style. Everything from the backgrounds and the characters to the tiny sprites on the map are in the same retro pixel aesthetic. The animations are also very well done and remind me of ye old RPGs and JRPGs. Clearly a lot of effort and attention went into making this, and I absolutely love it. The music is also wonderful and absolutely bopping. Here's the sample. Even if you're not that interested in this game, I highly recommend getting a copy of the soundtrack from the Steam store. The music is reminiscent of ye old retro RPGs and action games, but has this electro twist to it. It's just great. Loop Hero's unique blend of mechanics makes it a very fascinating game. It's even more surprising that 4 Quarters managed to make it work considering how many different elements are mixed into it. The tile combo mechanic causes a variety of unique interactions when you place different structures next to each other. This makes the game very interesting, and you're always out there experimenting and finding out what different tiles do together. There isn't a lot of story in this game, but for what is there, it's very interesting. The Lich was just trying to solve the heat death of the universe, as we all tend to do, before getting wound up in a cosmic conspiracy that's even way worse. There even is an in-game encyclopedia with a deeper explanation of the lore, story, and the characters. The dialogue and writing, while being minimal, is also very decently done. The characters don't sound like generic fantasy characters and actually say interesting stuff that you want to listen. Now, I did enjoy Loop Hero and have a lot to praise it for, but the game does have some issues that I would like to talk about. Starting with the fact that this game is extremely slow. As I mentioned before, this game basically plays itself and you can pause to equip items or place cards. The base speed at which your guy runs around doing stuff is very slow. That's why the game gives you an option to run at double speed, and trust me, you'll never want to turn that off. But even that is very slow. The game needs to have a 3 times or even a 4 times speed. Each run can last 30 minutes or even an hour sometimes, and you'll spend a good chunk of that time just waiting and watching. The game also requires a lot of grinding to get resources for crafting, which you need to progress, so this problem is even made worse. Speaking of grind, this game can be very grindy. Crafting items and constructing buildings at your camp is required for progression, but it also requires a ton of resources to gather. That means you will have to grind a lot to be able to unlock new things and get stronger to beat the farther bosses. This is made even worse because each level has a cap on how much resources you can gather. The resource cap is progressively eased until you reach stage 4, when the cap on resources is completely removed, meaning that you can grind as much as you want on the last stage. But this also means that it's even harder to collect resources earlier on in the game, and considering that this game has a lot of waiting and watching, it makes the grind way worse. Sometimes Loop Hero feels less like I'm playing a game and more like I'm baking something while occasionally keeping an eye on it to make sure my entire goddamn house doesn't burn down. In other words, it can feel like a goddamn chore. The slowness and the grind can make Loop Hero very tedious at times, but the main issue is with the core element of the game itself, which is the automation. The thing is, Loop Hero's highly automated gameplay, while very interesting, is not that engaging. Yes, half the time you're playing cards and sorting equipment, but the other half you're just waiting for your hero to do his thing. The problem is that, especially when you're grinding, the game is idle enough to make you want to go AFK and do something else, but it's not actually idle enough for you to go do that. The fights in the game, especially with the bosses, are extremely interesting to look at, but you can only look at them. You lack actual agency and can't influence the fight in any way other than changing equipment. Sometimes your hero will target the wrong enemy and all you can do is watch and cringe as he slowly and painfully gets his ass beat. Even if only the combat was more engaging, like if you could actually control the fight or use abilities, the game would be way more enjoyable and less tedious. The game forces me to sit there anyways, so might as well give me something to do with it rather than just stare. Some really basic things like just being able to level up or use health potions can only be accessed after upgrading the camp a bit, so you'll have to do some runs just to have these. A lot of games do this, and I don't understand why you want to waste the player's time by locking basic abilities behind a progression wall. I guess this is just a pet peeve of mine, but a lot of games do it and it's very annoying. This is a minor issue, but there's also a problem with Loop Hero's reliance on randomness. The cards and equipment you get are completely random. You don't actually draw cards either, you just get a random copy from your deck, as I mentioned before. So the thing is, you can't even adjust the number of copies of each card in your deck to improve the odds you have, like you do in a lot of deck builders. Due to this, sometimes you can have terrible runs just because you get a shitty hand that you can't play or get shitty equipment that you can't make a viable build with. Leveling up will let you choose between one of 3 random passives every time. There are a lot of passives that aren't very good though, so you can end up getting only options for crappy passives and completely screw your run up. This isn't a big deal on its own, but it becomes very annoying when combined with the previous issues I've mentioned, as if you get a crappy run, all you can do is start over from the very beginning and go through the tedium all over again.
Oh shit, here we go again.
Now, solving these issues, such as reducing the grind, would probably make the game shorter, but I wouldn't mind that at all. This is a $15 title, and it's going to take you 20 to 30 hours to beat. But because a lot of that time might be spent dealing with the tedium, even if the game's playtime is reduced by half, I don't think it's a big deal. I'd much rather prefer increased quality over quantity, and I think most people do too. Alrighty then. Let's have a quick look at the game's performance and settings before we wrap up. Loop Hero performs well with no major bugs or crashes. The game is locked at 60 FPS, but for a 2D roguelite, that's not a real big issue. The frame rate is stable and I didn't experience any stuttering, frame drops, or artifacting on my mid-range build with the 5700 XT. Moving on to the settings. The settings are pretty box standard. You have resolution, full screen, and all that stuff. It's also got separate audio sliders for everything and lets you turn off visual effects like the CRT filter that the game has. You can also change the font of the game if you find it hard to read the pixel art font. There's also a special font for helping people with dyslexia, which is wonderful and we need to see more of that. There are no colorblind options though, but I don't know how essential it would be for a roguelite 2D game like this one. But it is always useful to have these options regardless. Wrapping up, I do want to say that I did have fun with Loop Hero. The art and music are fantastic, and the game is unique in the way it blends elements from different genres into one game. Honestly, this is enough for me to recommend the game. But of course, no game is perfect and Loop Hero has its issues. Despite the game being very addictive, the grind and the tedium might get on your nerves. So keep that in mind when you're trying it out. The developers stated that they will be adding more content and fixing some issues with the game, so I will be looking forward to that. If you're concerned about the issues that I've mentioned, and well, even if you're not, I highly recommend using Cheat Engine to bypass the grind and tedium if it gets too annoying. Heck, if you don't know already, you can use Cheat Engine to bypass grind on almost any PC game. I'll put a link in the description for you to check it out. Loop Hero is currently available on Steam for 15 USD, 19 AUD, or your regional equivalent. If you're interested in games like Loop Hero, I would also recommend checking out Monster Train, Slay the Spire, and Hades if you haven't already. Thanks for watching, and do drop a like, subscribe, hit the bell button, and etc. if you think platypuses are cool. It's been Wizkidace, and I hope to see you on the next one.
Deja vu, I just blew space before I street and the